It was late summer 1944. The air over the Texas plains shimmered with heat as a U.S. Army truck rumbled down a dirt road, carrying men who had once fought beneath the rising sun. Dust rose behind the vehicle like smoke from a dying battle. Inside, the Japanese prisoners sat in silence, thin, sunburned, and staring through the slats at endless fields of corn and wheat. They had been told the Americans were savages, that capture meant humiliation worse than death. But now, as the truck slowed beside a farmhouse, they saw something no propaganda had prepared them for. A family waiting with pitchers of water, fresh bread, and steaming cups of coffee. The guards called for the prisoners to climb down. The men hesitated, unsure whether this was a trick. But the farmer, his face weathered and kind, stepped forward and gestured toward the shade. "Eat," he said softly. The translator's voice trembled as he relayed the word. The prisoners exchanged glances, suspicion, confusion, disbelief. In their world, an enemy did not share his table. Yet here, in the middle of a war that was tearing nations apart, a simple act of kindness was rewriting everything they thought they knew. In 1944, the Pacific War was still raging with unrelenting ferocity. Across the islands of the Pacific, from the jungles of New Guinea to the coral sands of Saipan, Japanese soldiers fought with a fanatic devotion that bewildered their American adversaries. For the Japanese, surrender was unthinkable. The Bushido Code, deeply rooted in the samurai tradition, demanded loyalty unto death. Captivity was the ultimate disgrace. A soldier who fell into enemy hands lost not only his honor but his very humanity. That was the code under which thousands of men marched into the infernos of Iwo, Jima, and Okinawa, and under which most of them died. But not all. As the tides of war turned, a growing number of Japanese soldiers were captured alive. Some were pulled from burning caves on Saipan, others fished from the sea after naval battles. By 1945, nearly 20,000 Japanese prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. Each man carried a lifetime of indoctrination, the belief that Americans were brutal, merciless, and incapable of compassion. The journey to the United States was disorienting. They were transported first to island holding centers like Guam or Hawaii, then across the Pacific in steel-gray cargo ships. Inside the holds, the men sat in silence, haunted by guilt and shame. Some could not meet each other's eyes. Others prayed for permission to die before arrival. When the ships finally reached the U.S. coast, San Francisco, Seattle, or Los Angeles, the prisoners were astonished. The cities were intact, untouched by bombs. America, the supposed land of decay and moral ruin, was vibrant and alive. From there, they were loaded onto trains under guard and sent deep into the heart of the continent, to isolated compounds in Texas, Idaho, Arkansas, Utah, and Nebraska. Behind barbed wire, they found clean barracks, medical care, and organized routines. For men who had expected cruelty, the quiet efficiency of American camps was confusing. The guards were disciplined but not hateful. The food was plentiful. The rules were strict, yet fair. The United States had committed itself to the Geneva Convention of 1929, a treaty defining the humane treatment of prisoners of war. The Japanese Empire had signed but not ratified it, and in practice largely ignored it. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were starved, beaten, and overworked, the brutal treatment stemming from Japan's view that surrender was dishonor. But in America, officials insisted the rules would be upheld even for the enemy. "We fight not only with weapons," one War Department memo read, "but with ideas of civilization." By 1943, as the war industry expanded and American manpower was stretched thin, the government faced a new problem: labor shortages on the home front. Millions of young men were overseas. Fields went unharvested. Lumberyards stood idle and factories lagged behind. The War Manpower Commission needed a solution. Their answer: the prisoner of war labor program. Under strict supervision, POWs could be assigned to agricultural and industrial labor, provided they were not forced into war production. Camps were soon organized into branch units, temporary work detachments near farms, canneries, sawmills, and orchards. The system benefited both sides. Prisoners could earn small wages, and American communities received desperately needed hands. It was here, far from the front lines, that two worlds collided. Most of the Japanese prisoners sent to work details had never seen the United States beyond fences. Their first glimpse of American civilians was often through the dust of country roads. farmers, shopkeepers, and their families waiting to receive them. The soldiers stood silent, rigid eyes downcast, expecting scorn. Instead, they found politeness. The guards carried rifles, but often kept them slung on their shoulders. The farmers, in their sweat-stained hats, gave brief nods of acknowledgement. Not affection, but respect. In the fields, the work was long and heavy. The Japanese prisoners picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Idaho, and cut lumber in Oregon. They labored under the same sun as the farmers, drank the same water, and wiped the same dust from their faces. Slowly, the barriers began to shift. It was in places like Camp Huntsville in Texas, Camp Rupert in Idaho, and Camp McCoy in Wisconsin that these small human moments began to unfold. The American camp administrators encouraged order and efficiency, but in the farms surrounding those camps, the relationships that formed were unscripted. The language gap was wide, but gestures bridged it. When a prisoner finished his day's labor and bowed, as custom demanded, the farmer would nod in return. When a prisoner dropped from exhaustion, the farmer's wife would quietly hand him a cup of coffee or a biscuit. The Americans didn't always understand the significance of these acts, but for the prisoners, each gesture defied everything they had been told. The Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans were crude, lazy, and immoral, that their culture was weak, that mercy was a sign of decay. Yet in the stillness of American farmlands, they witnessed a different reality. Men who worked with quiet dignity, women who showed kindness without fear, and a society confident enough not to humiliate its enemy. Back in Japan, civilians endured starvation. Cities like Tokyo and Osaka were flattened by firebombs. Families scavenged for rice. In contrast, American abundance was overwhelming. One POW later recalled his astonishment upon seeing white bread, something he hadn't seen since childhood, and plates of meat served even to captives. "We thought we would be beaten," he said years later. Instead, they gave us coffee. These impressions left a deep mark. For many of the captured soldiers, the American farm became their first glimpse of a life beyond war, one where strength wasn't measured by domination, but by restraint. The U.S. government monitored these interactions carefully. Every act of leniency had a political dimension. American officials believed that humane treatment could have strategic value, influencing the morale of the enemy and shaping Japan's post-war outlook. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, which oversaw the POW system, issued guidance that discipline must not degrade dignity. Still, this policy faced criticism. Some Americans protested the idea of enemy soldiers eating well while their own sons fought and died overseas. Editorials appeared in local newspapers questioning why Jap prisoners deserved humane conditions. But for the farmers, practicality often outweighed politics. They needed help and the prisoners worked hard. And gradually, resentment gave way to respect. It wasn't unusual for farmers to share lunch with the POWs under shade trees. The guards, knowing the men had no place to escape, allowed it. These shared meals became the beginning of something remarkable, a fragile understanding born from necessity. Over months of shared labor, gestures turned to words. A few Japanese learned English phrases: thank you, good work, coffee. Some Americans picked up bits of Japanese in return. When the day's work ended, the farmers' children would wave from the porch as the prisoners climbed back into the trucks. The first time it happened, the Japanese men stood stunned. One of them, years later, said, "That wave felt like forgiveness." These small human exchanges were not unique to one camp. Across the United States, from Texas to Minnesota, stories like this unfolded quietly, far from the front pages of war. Each one chipped away at the hatred that had fueled years of bloodshed. Behind those barbed wire fences, America's greatest weapon wasn't its machinery or its bombs. It was its decency. And that decency was about to be tested, because as the harvest season stretched on, something unexpected began to happen. The prisoners, once wary and silent, started to talk, not to each other but to the farmers themselves. About families, about food, about home. And soon, over shared coffee and stories in the fading light of American farms, the line between enemy and human would begin to vanish. They began as strangers across a furrowed field, wary eyes glancing up from under the sun, one side holding shovels, the other rifles. But the longer they worked side by side, the more the old divisions began to blur. By the autumn of 1944, something remarkable was happening in small American towns across the Midwest and South. The Japanese prisoners of war, men who had once sworn never to surrender, were quietly becoming part of the rhythm of American life. The U.S. military called them work details. Farmers just called them the boys. Under strict rules, each POW detachment included 1 or 2 guards for a group of 10 to 20 prisoners. They arrived early, often before dawn, packed into flatbed trucks, their khaki uniforms marked with large white PW stencils across the back. The air smelled of wheat, soil, and oil. And yet, over the noise of tractors, the clatter of tools, and the chirping of cicadas, a new kind of sound began to rise: laughter. For many of the Americans, these were their first real encounters with Japanese people. To them, the word Japanese had meant only one thing: the faceless enemy in war propaganda posters, men with sharp eyes and cruel smiles, storming through Asia and killing without mercy. But the reality before them was disarming. The prisoners were young, many no older than the farmers' own sons who were now fighting in the Pacific. They were disciplined, polite, and astonishingly hard-working. At first, communication was nearly impossible. Orders were given with hand gestures, shouts, or crude sketches drawn in the dirt. But work has a way of erasing language. When one man lifted a sack, another would help carry it. When a tool broke, someone silently handed a replacement. And after a few days, small bridges began to form. In Arkansas, local farmers recalled that the Japanese prisoners bowed at the start and end of each workday, a sign of respect that puzzled the Americans but soon became an accepted ritual. In Idaho, they worked the sugar beet fields from sunrise to sunset, pausing only when the farmer's wife appeared with a jug of cold water and biscuits. At first, the prisoners refused to eat in front of her, too ashamed to share a meal with civilians. But after days of insistence, they accepted, bowing deeply in gratitude. And that's where everything began to change. In one documented account, from Camp Huntsville, Texas, a farmer remembered the moment vividly. The day was hot, the kind of Texas heat that shimmered on the horizon. When the work was done, his wife invited the POWs to sit beneath the oak tree and rest. She poured them cups of coffee, black, steaming, unfamiliar. The men hesitated, looking at their guards for permission. The sergeant gave a small nod, and so, in silence, they drank. One of the men took a sip, frowned, then smiled faintly, a small gesture that carried more than words ever could. Later, the same group began to bring small gifts from camp: origami birds folded from scrap paper, carvings made from wood, simple tokens of thanks. The farmers accepted them quietly, and for the first time some shook hands before the truck departed. The guards noticed the shift too. What had begun as duty was turning into something gentler. Many American soldiers assigned to POW supervision were not combat veterans. They were older men or those unfit for frontline service. They saw in these prisoners not fanatics, but exhausted soldiers just trying to survive. By late 1944, many camps had relaxed their security measures. Some guards carried no rifles at all during farm work, trusting that escape attempts were rare, because where would they go? The land itself was their prison. The POWs quickly earned reputations for diligence. In Iowa, farmers wrote to the War Department requesting Japanese prisoners specifically, saying they worked harder than any labor we've ever had. In Colorado, an old rancher was astonished when the men repaired his broken fence overnight without being asked. They worked methodically, often humming under their breath. A few sang quiet, mournful Japanese folk songs that carried across the plains. But beneath the civility, there remained unease. The Americans had seen newspaper photos of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and Wake Island. Some had lost family in the Pacific. To share coffee with those responsible for such suffering felt almost unbearable. Yet when they looked at the faces across the table, tired, hollow-eyed, no older than their own sons, the hatred began to melt into something else. There was one moment recorded in a letter by an American farmer in Nebraska that captured this transformation perfectly. "I remembered my brother," he wrote. "He died at Guadalcanal. For 2 years I hated everything Japanese. Then these boys came to my farm. One of them helped me fix my plow. He couldn't speak a word of English, but he worked beside me all day. That night I brought him into the house for supper. My wife cooked stew. When he bowed before eating, I felt something in me change. I realized I wasn't feeding my brother's killer. I was feeding a man." These kinds of moments spread quietly, without fanfare or permission. Regulations forbade fraternization, but humanity often ignored regulations. Guards turned a blind eye. Farmers invited prisoners to Sunday meals, and little by little coffee became a symbol of trust, of forgiveness, of something far deeper than victory or defeat. For the Japanese prisoners, these gestures were staggering. Many of them had expected torture, starvation, or execution. Instead, they were treated with civility that defied all logic. The Bushido Code had told them that surrender stripped a man of honor. Yet these Americans, whom they had been told were barbaric, restored that honor in ways their own army never could. Some wrote about it years later. In memoirs and oral histories collected in post-war Japan, former POWs described their time in America not as punishment, but as revelation. One soldier from Saipan wrote, "We had been told the Americans were devils, but they spoke gently, even when we worked slowly. They offered coffee, bread, and sometimes their laughter. It was like being treated as human again." Another recalled the shock of seeing a farmer's wife hand him a towel after a long day in the field. "I had not been touched kindly since childhood," he said. The Americans, for their part, were also learning something profound. In 1944, propaganda had painted the Japanese soldier as fanatical and inhuman. Yet here they were, men who missed, their families who smiled shyly when praised, who bowed after every meal. For many guards and civilians, this broke through years of fear and resentment. In Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a chaplain recorded that during a Sunday service, several Japanese prisoners quietly attended Mass with the Americans. They stood at the back, heads bowed. When the final hymn played, they didn't sing, they simply listened. Afterwards, one POW approached the chaplain and said through a translator, "Your God is merciful. Maybe war will end when men believe that." The relationships that grew in those farmlands were fragile, but sincere. The prisoners began leaving small traces of themselves behind. Carvings, letters, even murals painted on barn walls. Some made paper lanterns for local festivals. Others helped rebuild sheds destroyed by storms. And when winter came, they worked in the cold without complaint, shoveling snow and repairing tools. What startled many Americans was not how disciplined the Japanese were, but how grateful. One farmer in Utah recalled that when his wife offered rice instead of bread at dinner, the prisoners' eyes lit up. "They smiled like children," he said. "It made us forget there was a war." Through these small acts, understanding replaced fear. Humanity replaced hate. It didn't happen overnight. But by the time 1945 arrived, the Japanese POWs and the American farmers had built something unique, a quiet peace inside a world still burning. But this fragile understanding would soon be tested. As the war in the Pacific reached its bloody climax at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the news of American deaths flooded home. Many towns were plunged back into mourning. Some demanded that the POWs be sent away. Yet the farmers who had come to know them refused. "They're workers, not killers," one said simply. That defense, from those who had every reason to hate, was perhaps the most powerful testament to what had been built. Because in those, farmlands war had been reduced to what it truly was. Not a battle of nations, but a tragedy between men who might have shared a meal had they been born on the same soil. It was in those moments, the clatter of tin cups, the warmth of shared coffee, the sound of laughter carried over plowed fields, that both sides began to understand something war had tried to erase. The enemy was human, and in the months ahead, as news of Japan's imminent defeat spread across the camps, that realization would come to define the closing chapters of captivity and change forever how two nations would see each other once the guns finally fell silent. By the spring of 1945, the war that had once seemed endless was finally nearing its end, though few yet dared to believe it. Across the Pacific, cities like Manila and Tokyo were engulfed in flame. The last Japanese garrisons clung desperately to shattered fortifications on islands that had already been declared secured. On Okinawa, young boys with bamboo spears stood against American tanks. And far away, behind the quiet fences of American farmland, Japanese prisoners of war listened to radio reports that spoke of a world they no longer recognized. They were men without homes, without armies, without certainty. Yet in the strange peace of rural America, life went on. The fields still needed tending. The livestock still needed feeding. And so, as the last great battles raged across the Pacific, the prisoners continued their labor, sowing seeds in foreign soil, unaware that they were cultivating the first fragile roots of reconciliation. One morning in late April 1945, the routine changed. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, guards announced that news from Europe had arrived. Adolf Hitler was dead. The camp fell silent. Then somewhere in the distance, an American worker cheered. Others followed. To the Japanese prisoners, it was bewildering. The war in Europe was not theirs, but the energy was contagious. They watched as their guards and the farmers they'd come to know smiled, shook hands, and spoke of peace. A word that felt impossible, but it was not Europe that haunted them. It was home. Weeks later, the news they had dreaded most arrived. Tokyo had been bombed. Then came Hiroshima. Then Nagasaki. The guards' faces told them before the translators did. The words "new weapon" meant little to men who had seen so much fire already. But when they learned of the destruction, entire cities erased, the prisoners fell into stunned silence. Some prayed, others wept openly for families they knew were gone. And yet amid that devastation, a quiet transformation unfolded across the American camps. For the first time, the Japanese prisoners were not simply laborers. They were men being mourned, pitied and comforted by those who had once been their captors. In Camp McCoy, guards brought newspapers showing the ruins of Hiroshima. One prisoner stared at the image for hours. When the sergeant offered him water, the man whispered, "My home is gone." The guard, a father himself, placed a hand on his shoulder. It was an unspoken moment of grace, one that neither man would forget. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the camps across America changed almost overnight. The men who had been enemies were suddenly no longer prisoners of a war that technically no longer existed. Yet they could not go home, not immediately. Repatriation took months, even years, as ships were organized and bureaucracies moved at the pace of peace. In the meantime, the U.S. government issued new directives. Prisoners were to be treated as potential ambassadors of post-war understanding. The Americans began to organize educational and cultural programs inside the camps, not propaganda, but learning. English classes, lectures on democracy, lessons in agriculture and civics. The goal was clear: to help these men return home not as tools of the old militarism, but as seeds of a new Japan. But in the smaller camps, those attached to farm details, something deeper was already happening. That autumn, when harvest season returned, the Japanese prisoners were invited back to the fields. The war was over, but the work continued. Now, though, they labored alongside Americans not as captives but as guests. The guards watched without rifles. Farmers called them by name. One elderly woman in Nebraska baked bread every Sunday for her boys, insisting they take loaves back to camp. At Camp Rupert, Idaho, a remarkable scene unfolded in September 1945. The local community organized a farewell dinner for the Japanese laborers. Long wooden tables were set up near the barns, draped with plain cloth. Farmers and prisoners sat side by side, eating stew and bread, drinking coffee under the fading light. Someone brought out a radio, and Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade drifted softly across the fields. One Japanese prisoner, a former teacher from Osaka, stood and bowed deeply before speaking through a translator. "We thank you," he said simply. "You have shown us a kindness we did not know was possible in war." When it was over, the farmers shook hands with the men they had once feared. Some gave small gifts, and a pocket knife, a Bible, a handkerchief. The prisoners returned the gesture with delicate carvings made from wood and wire, tokens of gratitude shaped in silence. Moments like these repeated themselves across the nation. In Colorado, when the final truckload of POWs departed, local families lined the road waving goodbye. Some of the Japanese men wiped tears from their faces. A guard remembered one soldier saying softly, "America is strong because it is kind." But not all felt peace. For some, guilt weighed heavier than gratitude. They could not reconcile the comfort of their captivity with the destruction that had consumed their homeland. One former officer wrote later, "We were eating meat while our people starved. That shame stayed with us." Others feared returning home where surrender still carried stigma. "We thought our families would turn us away," another recalled. "We did not know if Japan would even exist when we arrived." As the weeks passed, preparations for repatriation began. Each man was issued a set of clothes, a small allowance, and a certificate stating his good conduct. The Americans photographed them. Faces once hardened by war, now softened by months of peace. The photos show men smiling awkwardly, as if unsure whether they were allowed to be happy. When the transport ships finally arrived on the West Coast, many of the same guards who had once watched them disembark now stood at the docks to see them off. It was an emotional reversal, the end of a chapter that neither side had expected to write. One sergeant from Camp Huntsville later recalled, "They came here as soldiers of the Emperor. They left as men who had seen another kind of world." As the ships pulled away, the prisoners stood on deck, gazing at the receding coastline. Behind them lay a land that had once been their enemy, but had shown them something no battlefield could: dignity. Ahead lay a home in ruins, a nation searching for meaning in defeat. Among them were men who would later become teachers, engineers, and community leaders in post-war Japan. Some carried with them photographs of the American families they had known, smiling faces, simple farmhouses, the wide sky of Texas or Idaho. These images became symbols of a strange and quiet redemption. In later interviews, several former prisoners said that their time in America had transformed how they understood the world. One said one night, "When I saw Americans sharing food with us, I realized strength was not cruelty. It was compassion." Another wrote, "I returned to Japan believing that kindness could rebuild what war had destroyed." For the Americans, too, the experience lingered. Many farmers never forgot the men who had worked their land. Letters were exchanged for years after the war, some written in halting English, others translated by local pastors. In one case, a Japanese prisoner mailed a photograph of his newborn daughter to the family who had once guarded him. The farmer replied, "She is beautiful. May she grow up in a world where men no longer need fences." In those brief years behind wire and watchtowers, something extraordinary had taken root. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but recognition, the understanding that humanity could survive even the worst of wars. But history would not rest easily. The world beyond the camps was already shifting. The Cold War dawned. New enemies emerged. And soon, the memory of Japanese POWs working side by side with American farmers faded into the background of history, a footnote in a world eager to move on. Yet for those who had lived it, the memory endured. The sound of laughter over fields, the taste of coffee shared between enemies, the sight of farmers waving goodbye as the trucks rolled away. It was the quiet climax of a war story without battles, a victory not of weapons, but of mercy, and it would echo in the years to come, as both nations, once enemies, built a partnership that reshaped the modern world. The war was over, but for the Japanese prisoners of war scattered across the American heartland, the end of the fighting did not mean the end of their story. What came next was quieter, slower, yet in many ways even more transformative. By early 1946, thousands of Japanese POWs were still held in the United States. The War Department faced an immense logistical challenge, the repatriation of tens of thousands of captured men, each needing transport across the Pacific, documentation, and medical clearance. Camps that had once been surrounded by tension were now filled with uncertainty. The men who had been defined by war suddenly had to learn how to exist without it. For many, their lives inside the fences had grown into a strange kind of normalcy. They woke to bugle calls, worked in the fields, studied in classrooms, and shared meals that had once seemed unthinkable. The barbed wire still stood, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a symbol of fear. It was a boundary that separated the world they understood from one they no longer did. In camps like Camp McCoy, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Livingston, new programs emerged almost overnight. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division saw an opportunity, not to punish these men but to teach them. Japanese instructors were selected from among the prisoners to lead classes in language, civics, and agriculture. American officers brought in lecturers who spoke about democracy, industrial efficiency, and social responsibility. There were films, documentaries about American life, community, and freedom. It wasn't indoctrination. It was exposure, a glimpse of a world built on trust rather than hierarchy. The Japanese prisoners, disciplined by nature, embraced the structure. They learned English phrases, studied textbooks on farming, and even published their own camp newspapers. One issue from Camp Kennedy, Texas, featured articles about self-improvement, ethics, and post-war reconstruction. The editor, a former schoolteacher from Kyoto, wrote in one column, "We lost the war not because America was stronger, but because America believed more deeply in the worth of every man." These reflections revealed the slow but profound shift in the prisoners' thinking. What had begun as disbelief at their captors' kindness evolved into introspection and understanding that America's strength came not only from its weapons but from its ideals. The farmers who had worked alongside them noticed it too. Letters and small tokens began to flow between camps and nearby towns. Some Americans mailed books or photographs to their former workers. Others received hand-carved gifts, miniature birds, flowers, or wooden cups, inscribed with delicate Japanese characters meaning gratitude or friendship. In Iowa, a farmer's wife kept a small wooden doll on her mantelpiece for the rest of her life, carved by a prisoner who had spent one summer helping in her fields. "He told me," she recalled years later, "that he would go home and teach his children that Americans were not monsters." When repatriation orders finally came in late 1946 and 1947, the departures were emotional. Many American families gathered to see the prisoners off. They brought coffee, bread, and sometimes tears. For some of the prisoners, the farewell was harder than captivity itself. One man from Camp Rupert, Idaho, was seen kneeling in the dirt, pressing his forehead to the ground before the farmer who had treated him kindly. "You have shown me how to live again," he said through a translator. For others, the return to Japan was filled with dread. They knew they were going home to a devastated nation. Cities lay in ruins. The emperor had surrendered. Families were scattered, hungry, broken. Former soldiers were often viewed with suspicion or pity. Some POWs feared that their time in America would mark them as tainted, men who had lived too well while Japan suffered. Yet when they arrived home, a different reality awaited them. Japan itself was changing. Under American occupation, the country was being rebuilt not only physically but philosophically. Democracy, industry, and education were being reshaped from the ground up. And in that transformation, the returning POWs found a role they had never expected. As bridges between worlds, they had seen another way of life. They had seen how Americans worked, with discipline but also with fairness. How authority could exist without cruelty, how communities cooperated, how education mattered, how dignity was extended even to the defeated. They brought these lessons home, quietly and steadily. In Hokkaido, one former POW began teaching modern agricultural techniques he had learned from American farmers: crop rotation, soil care, mechanization. His methods soon spread, helping revive local food production. Another, once a soldier in the Imperial Army, became a teacher in Osaka, where he introduced his students to the concept of civic responsibility. Freedom, he told them, is not given. It is grown, like a field. Even in small gestures, the influence of their captivity remained. They drank coffee. They shared bread. They remembered how their American captors bowed their heads before meals, giving thanks for food and peace alike. The U.S. military noted this transformation with quiet satisfaction. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General described the Japanese POW program as an experiment in humanity that yielded extraordinary results. American officers wrote that the men who returned home from U.S. camps were among the most cooperative and progressive in occupied Japan. The broader context of post-war relations, this mattered. The 1950s would see Japan rise from ashes to become one of America's closest allies. Historians often credit policy, economics, and strategy. But beneath those grand forces were small human moments. A farmer offering coffee, a guard turning a blind eye to kindness, a prisoner realizing his enemy was capable of mercy. The echoes of those moments lasted decades. Reunions took place in the 1970s and 1980s, when surviving POWs returned to America as tourists. Some visited the same towns and farms where they had once worked as captives. Old men in suits met aging farmers on porches, shaking hands and smiling through tears. One Japanese visitor brought a photograph of himself as a young soldier, standing beside an American family in 1945. "You saved my life," he said simply. The farmer replied, "We just shared a meal." Even those who never returned carried the memories within them. In post-war Japanese literature, occasional references to the American kindness appeared in diaries and memoirs, not as sentimentalism, but as quiet testimony. It became a symbol of possibility, that even amid total war, humanity could endure. For the Americans who had witnessed it, the experience reshaped their understanding of the enemy. They had fought a nation that had attacked Pearl Harbor, committed atrocities, and fought to the death on Pacific Islands. Yet the men they met on the farms were not monsters. They were weary, polite, disciplined, and above all, human. It is said that a generation of Americans who worked alongside POWs came to see Japan not as a symbol of evil, but as a people who had been led astray. This subtle shift in perception helped lay the emotional groundwork for reconciliation, long before treaties and alliances made it official. The story of those POWs is often forgotten in textbooks. But in the living memory of those who shared those fields, it remained vivid. An Iowa farmer once said, "We didn't win the war in our fields. We won our humanity back." By 1948, nearly all the Japanese prisoners had been repatriated. The camps were dismantled, the barracks torn down or converted into schools and storage depots. But sometimes beneath the soil, farmers still found traces: a carved spoon, a coin, a piece of wire twisted into the shape of a bird. Each relic told the same story, that even behind fences, humanity found a way to survive. And when the last transport ship disappeared over the Pacific, carrying men who had once been enemies but now carried seeds of understanding, America stood silent once more. The war was over, but what those men had learned and what they had taught would ripple through generations. In the years to come, as Japan rose from ruin to prosperity and became one of America's most trusted allies, few remembered that the first bridge between them had been built not in boardrooms or on battlefields, but in dusty fields, over cups of coffee shared between captor and captive. In the quiet years that followed, long after the uniforms were folded away and the camps dismantled, what remained was not the memory of war, but the memory of grace. For those who had lived it, the images never faded. The glint of morning, light on barbed wire, the steam rising from a cup of coffee, the laughter of strangers who had once been enemies. The story of the Japanese POWs in America was not one of grand strategy or decisive battles. It was something smaller, humbler, and perhaps far more powerful. Proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable violence, compassion could take root in the most unlikely soil. These were men who had expected humiliation and found dignity instead. Farmers who had been taught to hate discovered understanding. Guards who had once watched for escape attempts began to watch for friendships forming. History remembers wars for their destruction. Yet in the folds of this forgotten chapter, there was creation, the creation of trust, of empathy, of the idea that peace is not forged in treaties, but in moments of shared humanity. The Japanese prisoners returned home carrying seeds of that belief, and from it grew a new era of partnership between two nations that had once tried to destroy one another. If war reveals the worst of mankind, then what happened in those American fields showed its best. It proved that mercy is not weakness, it is civilization's greatest strength. And long after the guns fell silent, the echoes of that strength continued to shape the world. Because in the end, history is not written only by victors. It is written by those who choose compassion when the world demands hate. And somewhere, in the rustling of wheat under an open sky, That lesson still whispers, a reminder that even in war's darkest shadow, humanity endures.